thrilled today to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Charles Walker. He's going to present the assault of the Ayacucho prison, March 2nd through the 3rd of 1982, the night that changed Peru. Dr. Walker is a professor of history at UC Davis. He teaches courses on all aspects of Latin American history, as well as on natural disasters, truth commission, social movements, and human rights. He has written many books, including graphic history, books such as Witness to the Age Revolution, The Odyssey of Juan Bautista Tupac Amura. Let's see here. I won't list all of the books, but let's see here. He's also co-edited several volumes in Peru, introduced and translated with Carlos Iguere and Willie Fiat, Alberto Flores, Galindo's Buscando un Inca, In Search of an Inca, and introduced and translated with Michael Lazada, Jose Carlos Aguera's Los Rendidos, The Surrender. He has held fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities, University of California, American Council of Learned Societies, Social Science Research Council, the American Philosophical Society, the Shelby Cullom Davis Center, and the Tinker Foundation. From 2015 to 2020, he held the MacArthur Foundation's Endowed Chair in Global Human Rights. He's also served as director of the Hemispheric Institute on the Americas and of Global Centers in Latin America through Global Affairs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Walker today.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this. Thank you for the center, because as director of the center, I know how much there is no such thing as an easy talk. There's lots of work and connections and PowerPoints and reservations and such. So, but anyway, I'm delighted to be here for a bunch of reasons. First of all, Madison has always been a really special place for me. As someone of my generation, i.e. last century, this was, in my period, the Center for Andean Studies. I mean, I was fortunate to be able to see Steve Stern, someone this place owes a lot to. Checked in on Florencia, Frank Solomon, and this period this was I studied in Chicago. To come up here to chat with them, consult about archives was very important, and also there are many people in this room involved with this story or on the Zoom as well. And I will try to keep looking at the camera. I was warned this is I shouldn't move around, and so anyway, I'm just very excited to share this project. So this is part of a larger project on youth in Ayacucho, which is, I should have had a map up here in the Shining Path. It's one of those projects that's gotten a little bit away from me, and it started looking hundreds and hundreds of pages. I was making progress, and I found these amazing sources, a number of sources, which I'll talk about at the very end, but mostly a trial for the policeman who committed this atrocity. And it was just this incredible sort of blow by blow what happens. And for someone who's always worked on the 18th and a little bit the early 19th century, to be able to go beyond like leadership and to tell this was just an incredible, it just was incredibly enticing for me as an historian. And as I developed it, and the argument I'll make today, and I really want to hear what you have to say, is, I believe it's not just an interesting moment. There are lots of interesting moments. We are in a very interesting moment in the United States. It's also a very unfortunate moment, but I do believe it changed Peru, and I'll talk about how this event, the war with the Shining Path, to understand what happened next. This evening really affects it. I'm also in the book addressing issues about how one event can affect structure. I saw the Sewell building. I thought of Bill Sewell, the historical sociologist, and sheds light on society and the moment, which are issues of microhistory. So if there are graduate students in history, these are some of the theoretical and methodological debates I'm taking on. And I will warn you, I'm finishing the book. The book has taken me a while, and now I've just had these, I'm obsessed with it. So if I ask the question and I go on too long or my voice raises, I'm known for my enthusiasm. Often my undergraduate evaluations are, he wanders a lot and he talks about soccer and stuff like that, but man, is he enthusiastic. So bear with me. And one of my goals then tonight is to sort of explain or justify why you should spend your lunch, listening about some odd event 40 some years ago. If I can do that, then I'm hoping I can do that with the book as well. And I will be very disciplined to make sure I give us time. So a little background, I always say the biggest mistake professors make is assume knowledge. I go to a talk about Croatia and people assume that I know the 3 major cities or, this and that, and I don't. So I don't want to take too much time. The Shining Path began its insurrection in May 1980. They did it the night before Peru returned to democracy after the election, the night of the elections, after 12 years of military rule. They were a small Maoist party based in Ayacucho, led by Abimel Guzman, Presidente Gonzalo, and you have on the right is his part of the incredible iconography of the Shining Path, who left behind these very rich, social realism, extremely muscular Andean people, and Guzman looking like Clark Kent here. And I mean, I really don't have it. I don't really spend the time and sort of the way to best understand Shining Path is via contrast. They were Maoist, which is unusual. They weren't had very little to do. Were very critical of the New Left. They weren't a social movement. Feminism, ecology, thinking about politics beyond el partido was not what they wanted to do. And the best scholars on them, and I'm not going to name any people, and I know there's some Peruvians, and I probably should, and probably go on Zoom, but if you ask me who, or certainly if you want to know what books, but some very good scholars have noted the heavy presence of Leninism and Lenin in their work about the focus on the party and things like that. So I mean, they're very different than Sandinistas. They're very different than the more urban or the different, Mir in Chile, Montoneros in Argentina. And this in some ways led them to be underestimated. No one paid much attention. When I've done lots and lots of interviews with people who were militantes of other parties, and I've also interviewed people who were in Sendero, and some of them still identify, and they say we were always as one author said, the primos pobres, the cousins you were a little embarrassed about, and that helped them grow. By 1982, the year I'm talking about, they were spreading nationally, but their focus was very much Ayacucho, the city of Huamanga. I'll use Ayacucho. Ayacucho is both the city and the region. It's more complicated than that. In the Peruvian state, which, as I said, in 1980, returned democracy, formal electoral democracy, if you will, re-elected President Belaunde, who'd been president in the 1960s, and he initially dismissed them. And this was a sort of key characteristic about him. Things will be fine. All the great political cartoonists always drew him as sort of oligarchical or patriarch on a cloud, never getting his hands dirty. He was not a young man at that time, and infamously called them bandits. People say it was bandidos is the quote that I found. So this is the context, if you will, and more specifically, what the larger project, what this builds from, is looking at youth militants. Why did young people join? What was the allure, and what happened to them? And part of this is circumstance. Historians will know this well. Almost miraculously or completely coincidentally, I found in Ayacucho via friends trials of like 160 minors, that is, minors under 18, who were captured and accused of being sendero. And it's incredible in 1980, 1982, because they would do a redada, throw 6 young people in the truck, and if you were 18 and a day, you were sent to different places to face horrible repression. It got worse as the 80s went on. If you were under 18, the state would still protect you somewhat. There are some horror stories, people who were then later kidnapped, but I have, if you will, information about these cases, and it's a fascinating group, and this is the larger project. And I'm interested in sort of how the Shining Path studied, or how they spread, and decided to work really on the city of Ayacucho, which is curiously understudied. The best work right now in Shining Path are by Quechua speakers, a language I don't speak. People like Ponciano del Pino, Renzo Roni, who speak Quechua, are doing rural studies, and the really key question of, did local communities support initially Shining Path? And yes, there was some support. And what happened? Where was the ruptura? Where was this breakdown? Because by the late 80s, peasant indigenous communities were not supporting the Shining Path. And so I've sort of said, no, I'm going to work on the city, because I don't have the Quechua skills, and because I found this incredible database. And so what you have in these early years are pretty public forms of politics by these young people, most recruited in high school. I had an interview with a former senderista who laughed and said, all you estudiosos, académicos, a term was not positive, put it that way. You look at the university, because the university, UNSACH, University of San Cristobal de Huamanga, has always been in the center. And he said, we start in the high schools, and it's absolutely true. And so often at 14, 15, recruited, This is the one publication I have an article about sort of the peer pressure and how they were recruited, but they were young people who believed in the revolution. Ayacucho had been a center of fighting the military, taking on. They looked up to the elders who had in a variety of leftist parties had fought the milicos, had been thrown in jail, had questioned Lima centralism. And now these young people were recruited into a Maoist party. So in these early years, what it was like the best is the Spanish term agitación, these very, I mean, doing pintas, quick fire graffiti, if you will. They would ransack a store. One important figure in this book was arrested when the bookstore was ransacked and he grabbed a book. And he claimed he wasn't at a party, but for the police, they consider him busy. It got more and more violent, you know, breaking the windows of municipal buildings in my 82. It's starting some use of dynamite, threatening, and one horrific practice in my mind, executing policemen. They would go up to policemen and shoot him behind his. There's a few cases of Herb as over 95%, 98% men, and then steal the pistol. And this was often done somewhat publicly. It was an act that brought you, confirmed you were in the party. There was no going back, and it gave them much needed arms. And what's curious to me, and something I'm still trying to figure out, this is one of the more famous young leaders, Edith Lagos, who is a fascinating case. We can talk about her. She, among other things, she was a poet from a recently well-off merchant family. The family avoided repression later, and I think there must have been some payoffs and things like that. She's also very photogenic. There are other pictures of her. She looks very different, and it's sort of the Che Guevara. If Che had been ugly, you know, would he still be the icon that you can see on probably still in dorm rooms in Madison, things like that. But so you have these young people, and what strikes me is they really weren't going clandestine. The leaders were. Guzman was already moved to Lima. The well-known leaders, a bit older, men, large, although Guzman's wife and a few women, there's the role of women. So these were young people that would go out and do a graffiti, do an escuela popular, which were these workshops where young people were taught about Mao. They would read Mariátegui, the Peruvian Marxist whose name Shining Path comes from. And it wasn't what everyone says is everybody sort of knew who they were. So in the Shining Path, there's always had this allure of we were incredibly secretive. We want to avoid the mistakes of the Montoneros Mir, where you capture one person, treat him or her, you know, torture, and then they give up 18 names, and it was your 16 people from your Salón de Sociología. They always claimed they didn't have this, but in this early years, they did. So the context of this jailbreak is some of the important leaders, including Edith Lagos, who you see here, Carlos Alcántara, who I'll mention later, and arguably Ildebrando Pérez Huaranca, who's a writer. I know a couple of literary people doing literature here know him as a writer. He just won some awards, and when he was arrested, an arrest who I know a lot about because some of the key people here fell, there was a national campaign, major writers, Scorza, and I think Cornejo Polar, Peruvians, and a couple of people know who those are, wrote letters indignant, you're just throwing anybody in jail, and he clearly was in the Shining Path. A comment that on Zoom, and maybe that recording, anyway, some people will still argue that his role. So anyway, in 80, 81, 82, there's this sort of growing wave of Shining Path activities. People are looking at it with sort of sympathy in the sense of these are daring young people that will throw rocks. The police, often pot-bellied, bad shoes, will run after them and they escape in the market, and these sort of adventurous things. But it's escalating. It's becoming more violent. In 81, there's a shootout, they're starting to kill police. There's more confrontations, but this very important youth generation, more and more of them are arrested in this jail. So this is the key event, and this is where I have to really watch the clock because I don't want it to be half an hour ago and I'm still in slide number 3. But this is the event that this is a 40-page chapter where I can tell you who was where and what happened. And it really is a sort of Hollywood-esque adventure. It's an incredible victory for the Shining Path. And I don't have any images. There's some photos, but there's blood and dead people. I don't do these, and I probably should have done a map here. But basically, 75 Shining Paths and their Luminoso members assault the jail at 10:30. They had commandeered a truck from a guy who argued he was too drunk, wouldn't do it. They made him drive. They drove a truck, and I'll show you the map in a minute. Behind the jail, they sent out grupo de retention groups to the different police stations with guns, so the police couldn't respond quickly, blew up the front door and took advantage of a house that was built next to the jail, literally contiguous, which made it unbelievably easy to escape because you could get over about a 4 or 5 meter wall. They set ropes up there a little bit, and they were all supposedly working out. Eddie Lagos had just won an atletismo prize in the jail. Everybody later figured out they were trying to get in shape. They jumped over this wall, made it to the back, and many of them went into this truck. 2 policemen were killed. The first policeman killed, whose son is actually a well-known, very respected anthropologist. Very few people will know this. I'm going to be very careful of the name, but he was, from the street and from the side building. They shot at him. His comrade, there were 2 in the tower. They didn't have grenades. They didn't have a lot of arms. They were basically sitting ducks. So one was shot, and then another policeman was killed as they stormed the front door. The 9 Shining Path members died, and I know there's more because some people they always took their wounded. They didn't get everyone, but presumably there are a couple people who we can't figure out what happened to, and might have been died of their wounds a day later or been recaptured, and the chaos. It's just, I won't go into I can't really give a full description, but it was just an incredible victory for the Shining Path. They had calculated that at least 35 dead. That was what they were willing to do. Guzman was very, very willing. Guzman, who was never near the battlefront, was very, he would accept sacrifices of others very well. So he'd say, we're going to take this, they would calculate, they would plan it. One of the amazing stories is they had tried 3 nights before and failed. It had been a fiasco, and the Peruvian state didn't fortify. They didn't put guards across the street. They didn't include more police. They sent more police. They had gotten there the day of March 2nd, and they were tired. They'd come by truck. They'd gotten soroche, altitude sickness, so they were all sleeping. So this happens. The police, who were divided into 3 forces, never come out hours later, and the military, who were there but not really engaged in the fighting, they don't leave the quartet. So it's a pretty stunning victory for the Shining Path. One of their members, a doctor, was killed in a shootout afterwards. I have incredible sort of, blow by blow information about that. And later he was criticized. He shouldn't have been there. He should have been elsewhere. But it couldn't have gone better, if you will, for the Shining Path. Again, it's always hard to say these things. And you say it's, discussing military history, he said X won the battle, but they lost 1,000 people. That's a very big but. The police also had dozens and dozens of wounded. One of the best sources, someone who wasn't in the hospital, what I'll talk about in a minute, ended up losing a leg because, the Peruvian police wouldn't pay him for a surgery in the United States and such. But anyway, it's this night. They take the city. Residents, I'll talk about interviews in a bit, tell stories of, not knowing what's going on. They think they're actually assaulting somewhere else. People don't leave their houses. And all the sort of the concern and fear by people living around it. Neighbors would tell me how they prepare, lots of little things, how they prepared barbed wire, making sure the police didn't come out immediately, and battle him. In one of the debates, and I'll go to the hospital next, is Gustavo Gorriti, who's the Peruvian journalist in the Shining Path, a key figure in all this. He wrote a very sharp, his reporting has held up really well with this. The police all said we were attacked by 50 members with machine guns, and he went and counted bullets and said there was like 15 bullets here. Wasn't that many, but in defense of the police, they say we didn't have chaleco antibala. We didn't have the equipment, bulletproof jacket. Thank you. They didn't have decent headgear. They were poorly armed. And again, these are very hard sort of ethical issues that some of these people are going to be involved in the slaughter I'll talk about. But the police, I think, justifiably were scared to death, because even with 2 members of Shining Path in the corner, they would come out, and even if one had some sort of assault weapon and the other had a gun, it kept them at bay. So the police came out when it had been going on for an hour. They were already loading up the truck, and that's where these confrontations, that's where many of the Shining Path members, including a well-known doctor who was also a sort of cause celebre. People said he couldn't have been in Shining Path. He was dragged out. And it did prove that he was in the Shining Path, and they identified his gun, that his metralleta, which had been taken from a police assault. And among the fugitives, people I've mentioned already, Edith Lagos and Ilirando Perez Huaranca. So, and what happened, what most people remember, what's curious to me, I mean, or it's interesting, is when I talk to people in Lima who are, my age, who were, alive in 1982, or, followed the news, political, they'll remember what happened hours later. And so I won't, and again, I have images here, and I'm going to try to be, brief and not go too into the horrors, but nor do I want to cover it up. So the police, the different forces meet by the jail. Once it's literally smoldering. I have this great quote. My first book was called Smoldering Ashes, so it might be Smoldering Ashes too. Meet, and they rush to the hospital saying they're going to attack our people there who are on guard. And it was very unclear who did what. It's years of blame. I now have the story. I can with pretty good confidence, I know who was where. And again, my book is not investigative reporting. I'm not trying to get anyone tried. This is not what I'm after, but I do want to tell the story well. So what this mixed group of police storm into the hospital. Miraculously, in one of the trials, the portero, who is a fascinating figure from Ica, talks about them breaking the gate, pointing guns at him, saying, "Get out of the way." And they storm in, and there are 5 accused Shining Path members. These are all accused. Again, none of them have been convicted in the jail. 4 men and 1 woman, and they basically go after them. They forced the guards to release them. The guards who were watching them in the trial said, "I was forced to do it." Other sources said they did it willingly, that they are tried for this, and ultimately dragged them down, murdered them, 3 of them in brutal fashion, and left them right outside the hospital, different places. There was a 4th they left for dead. He had IV. They strangled him with the IV, and he miraculously survived. And the other incredible story, the lone woman they targeted, the police grabbed her, had her up against the wall, and there was bombs went off. The police panicked, thinking that Shining Path was attacking. They went down the hallway, and and this is an incredible story, 3 other patients, presumably nothing to do with the Shining Path, took her in and hid her under a bed. Police came back, and these moments that are just, again, this should be, you think of movies, good or bad, couldn't find her and let her be. It's a woman I have not interviewed, and I think I'm going to sort of leave aside because this is not a story she probably wants to return to. But this is the moment. This massacre was what would not go away. So the reaction we have, the government denied it. This is what Belonde did very well. We have the archive of the Consejo de Ministros, the cabinet meetings, and so I have how, and it's public-private. I mean, it's not all the conversations are there, I'm sure, off the record, but there are reports of, how they debated it and things like that. So initially, Belunde denies, scapegoats, dismisses, stalls, stonewalls. It's almost an exercise, although something that lying governments don't do anymore, or they're better at, they mix their message. So one ministro would go out and say it was done by, we think it was Cubans, and then another ministro would say, now we know it was done by, so-and-so. And one day Belunde would go out and say, there would be an investigation. His ministro interior, and all these names are very important, but I'm not giving them to not drown you in detail, would contradict himself. Initially, the government and the press blamed international communism. I had to put this up, as you read Spanish, this is the most exaggerated one. Expresso, which was a far-right sensationalistic paper owned by the prime minister, Ulloa, blamed European sociologists of leftist persuasion, humanists of Maoist tendency, painters dressed as hippies. They've all been in the university that germinated. I have it. I don't have my train. I didn't. That created this extreme Trotskyite group, and every Trotskyite dies at this because they hated the Shining Path. And if you know anything about the left, Trotskyites and Maoists don't exactly get along. But anyway, this is just one. This is the most extreme. But basically, the press, the pro-government press aligned with the government, went through. It was the foreigners, it was Cubans, it was Czechs, it was Russians, Then they say, well, no, but they were trained overseas. They slowly and everything. They realized this was a Peruvian mission. There was no Shining Path really did not have much international support. The Gang of Four, the Cultural Revolution was over, which they venerated. China was taking its path that we know up until today, and so didn't have any really foreign support. So what's fascinating, what's important for me is the press did not let this go away. I mean, there had been other massacres, and this was but this one in part because it was so sensational. It was urban. There were pictures. The next day there are, and I don't have that many of them because many of them include bloodshed and things. And it just, the news cycle, Belunde said, okay, we're gonna take all this crap for 3 or 4 days. It'll blow over like any government scandal. This was in the news cycle for 6 months, a year for a series of readings. So one of the elements here I'm really trying to get is, if you will, a micro history of the press, how they kept this and what happened. So in the book, what I argue, the changes are that almost that evening, the next meeting, they say, we've got to build new jail. This is a picture of the jail 2 years before by a wonderful photographer, Ned Alarcon, who passed away recently. We did an exhibit of his work in Loom, the Memory Museum, last year. It had actually grown a lot, but these are just sort of these, choza almost type where the new population slept, and they had crafts there, taller de artesanía, where they did crafts and such. But you can see the big front wall in the back there, but in the back, and I don't know if I include that picture, it was much smaller than that. It was very provisional, not particularly any expert on the carceral state, either in favor of it to build modern penitentiaries with steel, said this is ridiculous. And this is a state of most jails in Peru outside of Lima. There was Lurigancho, which was a big steel modern jail built in the 1960s, but right after this they began the construction of another one in Lurigancho, and a series including a horribly repressive or brutal one in Puno were used for the worst. So this was a decision. This night they said, we can't go on like this. And the press also, the La República, which is an interesting newspaper because it's left-leaning, progressive, but very sensationalist, and they were living at almost daily reports of these criminals. They were romanticizing, who all had great, El Tuerto, the cross-eyed, El Chueco, el Asesino Romántico. They all, and I lived in Lima then. It was like my first thing I'd read. I love those things, these sort of sensational account. But there was also behind it a real criticism of the conditions of jails, which are horrific. Tuberculosis, abuse. All the jails had 3-4 times the population. So for the rights of the prisoners, it was horrible. But for controlling them, let alone reforming them, impossible. The prisoners basically ran the jail. So this is the night, and I have this well documented. One of the great problems is there was a mass building spree of jails, lots and lots of money spent. That archive does not exist. There were many, many fortunes made. It was overseen by Montesinos, the right-hand man of Fujimori, and Peruvians who know what that means, just massive amounts of corruption and insider deals to build these new jails. It also, that night, the other second major change is the armed forces are sent in. This is the debate in the press by the left, the right. Can the police do it? The police are divided. There are 3 forces. They don't share information. PIP, Guardia Civil, y Guardia Republicana. They're at best trained in a sort of, counter-terrorism for a single event. Those who have been in the School of the Americas in South Carolina, but they weren't trained. They weren't prepared for this. There's just story after story. They lost their intelligence that they had about these groups. And so the debate is, do we send in the military? And it's a very tough debate. Belaunde fears if the military steps in to fight them, they won't ever go back to the cuartel, and this could lead to a coup. So you get these very odd alliances. The left fears the milico, the fears the military. They're saying, we have defeated them, we sent them back. In this sort of new embrace of democracy, they're saying we shouldn't let them back in, whereas realists, moderates are saying the shining path can outfox, can defeat the police. So I think it's from here, and I track these debates really well. I think it's an important when the police when the armed forces are in. And I cut this slide. I probably should have included. And this is when they arrived in Ayacucho at the very end of December '82. This is when human rights. This is when it just becomes brutal, and there are thousands of dead. Remember, this is a conflict. I didn't summarize that. It says with in the end at least 70,000 dead. Controversial figures. The Truth Commission. Most people think it's an underestimate. The Truth Commission hinted at that as well. You know, just to give you an important element, unlike the Southern Cone or Central America, which is being funded by U.S. government, where 95% of the victims had been killed by the military. This was the opposite, or this was different. And according to the Truth Commission, 54% of those dead had been killed by the Shining Path. They used very brutal tactics. So in the long, if you will, military history of the conflict, human rights, this to me is a key moment. It's also, and this is the chapter that I have not made much. I mean, I've been working on it for a couple of years, and I, you know, in some ways was peripherally involved in human rights groups then. I believe this is when a national human rights community created. The family members of the victims, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, demanded justice for those, particularly those executed in the hospital. They were incessantly demanding, meeting with ministros and things like that. There were organizations, many affiliated with the church, left-leaning church, who had been important for demanding social justice, but also when there were street protests, when there were paros nacionales, there'd be hundreds wounded. They were the ones who took people to the hospital, or if young people were dragged into the jail, made sure they got out. But these were small, and I've interviewed much of the leadership. I've known some of them. Pancho Soberon, one of the key leaders, passed away. And they say, yeah, this is when we realized that we needed to unify more. And I think the press is very important here. The left, La República, El Diario de Marca, which is, again, I won't go into all the details, would not let these stories die. They insisted on justice, on no impunity. And these battles about, you know, pro-government, conservative press, dismissing this, and the left progressive groups demanding justice, it's very much a deja vu. It's just, and I still haven't figured out how to word this, and I'm reading things about contemporary history and such, but, you know, as someone who's always worked on you know, centuries, you know, 18th century, 19th century, it's very different. These people, a lot of these people are still alive, but there is so much that feels actual, like it's true. On the other hand, things have changed. You know, the newspapers, the kioscos aren't, people don't, you know, immediately in the morning go, if they can't afford, go read all the papers. But the sensation of civil society coming together, the press, organizations, the Catholic Church has a group, and then some politicians. Here I have Javier de Canseco, who became a very important congressman, or was congressman and senator, controversial figure. The right hates him, still does. But he took on this case, particularly of, you know, what the victims in the hospital. He wouldn't let it go. He's known for being tenacious. I've sort of tracked it. The other image I have, this is from PRODE, the Pro Human Rights Association. They took on this case. So my argument is this is the moment when these organizations began to come national in 84 and 85. They really come together. How important this is, whether it's a step in, you know, I'm not sure, but I really do think it's an important moment in human rights. So let me talk about and I guess I should say a lot of this was focused on these three victims at the hospital who were so brutally killed. And, you know, when I've talked to some very intelligent policemen who were not at the hospital and were very critical what happened, but they say nobody cared about, you know, the first guy, this poor Aronés, Florencio Aronés, there's no reason not to name him, when Shining Path came in and shot him. And some of the members of Shining Path will even now, later, some of them, their views are vary greatly. Some still absolutely follow the company line, take no criticism. They always tell me, you've written about the Tupac Amaru rebellion. They killed people there. Why is it we wanted a revolution? We are, they still believe it. We're going to lead to, you know, these are small sacrifices that you have to make, things like that. But the police often say nobody cared about us. And this can be a very reactionary, the equivalent of Blue Lives Matter. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, you know, this sort of, you can't demand human rights. You can't demand rights for others. Police come first. But there was something to it, particularly police in Peru who are lower class, always, the term always used is their classic cholos, you know, and people who are of indigenous background, more urban and things like that. And so there were discussions about this. And that Prodi actually, you know, said we defended these people, or when police were actually thrown in jail, we actually gave them some coverage because they deserved a decent trial. So I want about 5 minutes more. Let me just go over a couple of the things. So the sources, this is a map of the jail that the Shining Path had. I mean, they were there. I can tell you what's where. One of my what took me a while, and again, these are, you know, this is very much the weeds, and sometimes I think this doesn't matter to anybody but me, and I get obsessed about it, is I was using pictures by Uonen Alarcon. I think I have one more coming up. These wonderful pictures. These are from, he didn't remember, probably 1977. They had, that Caretas took these great pictures. I think it's actually the poster for the event. I didn't use one. They had built a lot. These were so torn down, and there was another new building. So I kept getting like, they threw the dynamite from the West Tower. There's no West Tower and things like that. But the Shining Path had this map, and they planned it very well to break through. This is the front door. Here's a beautiful plaza. The Plaza Mayor, the Plaza de Sucre is 5 blocks here, and they parked the truck. I think there was probably a second truck back there. So they broke through here. This is the women's area. Very, very few women where they controlled. So a lot of this I received because I have the trial about the hospital, about what happened in the hospital. There's a, you know, it's I was going to show a picture of it. I probably should have. It's so complicated. It's such a labyrinth that I actually had a student who sort of assisting Ayacucho do an archaeology of it, because I couldn't get, it would go, you know, Corte de la PIP, and then it would go to the Corte Superior, be bounced back to Ayacucho and sent out to, you know, Corte Dos. I literally couldn't figure out, the process. And this is in my human rights chapter. What I want to do, I'm going to talk about this, because this is a trial of anywhere from 8 to 22 policemen who are accused of participating in the massacre and in the hospital. And I'll talk a bit about that at the very end. As I mentioned, you know, I've interviewed, this is new for me, for Tupac Amaru. I wasn't able to, I mean, I've interviewed people about the memory of Tupac Amaru, and other things I've written about, but it's curious. People ask me, it's a moment, there's something about 40 years, people really want to talk about it. People who are, first of all, people are getting old, so something I know well. You know, they're like, hey, I want to, you know, you ask someone my age, hey, how were the how were the protests when you were a student? And, you know, somebody goes on for 15 minutes. I find a lot about that. I've asked like neighbors, and people say, well, she probably want to talk about it. She doesn't remember. She's, you know, viejita. And an hour later, she's like ordering, you know, get the gringo a Coca-Cola, you know, and going on and things like that. And I think, and I've tried to be pretty fair, and I'm still looking for, found these incredibly helpful, really rich, you know, relatives of victims, police, neighbors, journalists. I've gotten a great photo selection. One ex-ministro was a very important figure in those years, 35 or so. And there's quite a bit of sort of openness of a little bit about how we live this period. And again, I think if you did, you know, I'm sure oral histories of Madison and its grandiose moments in the 60s protesting the Vietnam War, if you talk to people, you know, the old guy who goes to the cool coffee shop and he was there, he'll be very willing to talk to you. Very briefly, it's a complex topic. I've talked to former members of the Shining Path. There were participants here. They have to be very careful right now, because there are still Shining Path. There's no life imprisonment, and so many of them are about to be released. But the Peruvian state, and again, I don't know this well enough, and I should be more careful. I mean, I should be reading here to be careful, is now adding on to sentences. So people who were about to be released after being in jail for 35 years and then committed their sentence, they say, oh, but you were also in that car bombing where eight people died. We're going to add that to your sentence. So the sort of official Shining Path has to be very mum about it. And I think I would have 5 years ago, would have probably had more, but I have been able to get more members. So I'll admit, I've not interviewed anyone who escaped the jail. I've interviewed someone who had 2 brothers, one who was in jail, one was in the assault, one escaped. He was the one who was in the assault, died, things like that. Newspapers and magazines are incredible. It's just, this is a period when, you know, young people in Peru, and I did a taller in Ayacucho about this. They couldn't believe the debates that, you know, the leftist press and the debates, which Peru doesn't have right now, you know, worldwide newspapers and magazines have declined, but it's unbelievable for facts, but also discourse and some of the things I think I probably skipped that point. Where did I? Oh, I forgot this. Behind this, there was already this fascinating debate about what to call the shining path. Terrorist, narco-terrorist, which is if you look on Wikipedia, they claim that Belunde coined the term in 1983, which is false. It was earlier and it might have been Colombia. Criminals, there's still debate. And those Peruvians here will know exactly what I'm talking about because today, conservatives will not, the official term, the Truth Commission is internal armed conflict, conflicto armado interno. They don't accept that. It's terrorism. And this debate continues to happen. Terruqueo is another phenomenon. I'm happy to talk about that. So newspapers, there are some photo collections. And as I mentioned, this incredible government, the Consejo Ministros, I have like their meeting, what they argued about. And they openly say, what do we call these guys? And they don't want to use the term guerrilla because of its allure. It was still seen, they understood that this was too much respect for them. So they fall into terrorist, narco-terrorist, which I talk about, and I just written about that. There's a bit of truth, but not really yet. They are not linked to the narcos. And then the final point, I said I'd stop right about now. So, and one of the things, this is another Hugonet. I knew I'd know the picture. This is one of the Taller de Artesanía. This is actually the back wall, one of the walls they escaped from. So they put ropes here to get, so people would, so they broke out of the patio, rushed out via dynamite. There were ropes hanging there, climbed the rope, and then could jump right into a house next door. One unfortunate woman broke her ankle. They captured her. I have her testimony and things, but it was relatively easy. I mean, if you were to go over to the Wisconsin, whatever the prison, this is not how you keep people in jails very well. But what I'm talking about here are these, who do I name and what do I not, who do I not? And I talked to Steve Stern about this, who I hope many of you, most of you should know, the historian who was in such a great presence in Latin American history and was a figure in Wisconsin. For his book, his wonderful trilogy, I think it's 3, on memory in Chile, he said, and this is what I'm doing, public figures, people whose names are well known, there's no reason to use a pseudonym. It's just too obvious. But if there's any doubt, I'm changing people's names. So it'd be like, we were joking yesterday, it'd be like 20 years from now saying a South African who was with Nazi sympathies who took over the government, just say Elon Musk. Sorry, I just had to get my zing Elon Musk. And so this is hard. And so when there's any doubt, I'm using pseudonyms. I'm using it for, and actually it's very hard organizationally. If someone is disorganized, I got to be careful because I changed the name and I changed it again. I couldn't remember which case it was, and things like that. And again, I've had very little pushback about it. No one, if there's one little incident, it was someone more of his alcohol problem than anything else. People are surprisingly open about this and sort of want to talk about it. I mean, people in Ayacucho said people don't understand the context. You don't know how we suffered. There's also a little bit of weird sort of nostalgia. And the same thing happens in Lima with my generation of toque de queda, but above apagones, when, the lights were always going out, you had nothing to do. And there were, they toque a toque. You just closed up your house. You couldn't go out 12 to 5. You bought a lot of liquor and you just partied till the sun came up. Of course, it was atrocious. People were dying, poverty, etc. It's this sort of nostalgic tendency. But this is what I'm doing so far. I'm using some names who were absolutely public figures. When I've interviewed, for example, the one police who gave such an incredible interview, he was happy to use his name, and I'm going to allow a lot of people to see what I've written about them to make sure it's factual. I don't know how this works with censorship, if they want to really change it, how I'd stick, this is new to me, but at least important, I want to respect their rights. And finally, and I want to open up the question, this is a poster by Shining Path celebrating the 1 year of this. So for the Shining Path, this entered their iconography, into their history. They recognized people who had been killed. It was in some ways very unfortunate. There were a lot of people fighting in courts who said, our father, our brother, our daughter was not in the Shining Path, but when the Shining Path recognized them as martyrs of the party, it really hurt their cases. So anyway, I know I covered a lot of ground. I'm going to stop so we have 12 minutes. So anyway, thank you very much. Enthusiasm there. I know I covered a lot. The alternative was to do a single chapter, but I wanted to give you the big picture. So anyway, I'm looking forward to questions, criticism. I don't know if any will come in on Zoom, things like that. You got that right, Jacob? So yeah.
Presentation, Charles. In this case, I'm wondering about the use of instrumentalization of terrorism in Peru, because very common person in the country, oh, you belong to the left front, to the left wing, oh, you're a terrorist. You protest against the government, you're a terrorist. You do a lot of things,
Yeah.
you're a terrorist. So the idea of how historians, how anthropologists, social scientists cannot change the idea, no, of having some political beliefs or protest represents or represents a way to show your intention. But in the case of Peru, when you show the case of the press, when you show the hippies or less sociologists from other people, but 23 years ago after that event, magazines, social media in Peru continue reproducing that idea. No? For example, during the protest, again, Dina Boluarte said, no, they are financed by Poncho Rojo, that is an organization from Bolivia, or they are financed by Cuba. Even also congressman, no, they receive financing from Iran or North Korea. And so, how we can combat that idea of terrorist, people that is labeled by terrorists from different ideas?
Yeah, it's a really, really hard question. So what I'm trying to do is deconstruct, the term terrorism. I use it between quotation marks, the intellectual I've written a lot about and worked with, Alberto Flor de Galindo had an early text that, really talked about this as othering and such. I mean, one of the things here is the government is lumping together, and I said it very quickly, all of the left. So you have a very rich left, you have emerging new left of, environmentalists, new social movements, aren't believers in, that PC is a party. You have these different groups and they surge, they divide, they come back, but they're very, Barrantes becomes mayor of Lima in 83. For conservatives, they're all the same. They are Diaz Canseco, this figure, he is still treated, as a supporter of terroristas, because he would say, if you capture a woman, she's accused of being a member of the Shining Path, you have no right to torture her, rape, and all the horrible things. I didn't give I could talk more about the context of it. On the other hand, it's gotten to the point where, for example, I've been very critical. There are pro Shining Path social scientific works, and you can't use euphemisms. It was a popular war. It was a just struggle. Well, I mean, the Shining Path went after the left. I mean, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. A large of their victims were people who were in the Socialist Party rivals. They were dead. They did do car bombs. I mean, these are activities that cannot be accepted. And so what I've said about these works, and I mean, I haven't written, it's more comments and but in Ayacucho, there was a sort of controversial event and I was there, is we should talk about this. I mean, I do believe through the Enlightenment, bringing it up, don't repress it. We had a chat with a couple of Peruvians about, family issues, about how people silence everything and the Dio Mañoso, nobody talks about, I'm a believer in like bringing it up sensitively. But, when I hear the Terroqueo from the right, I'm very critical of it. But when I hear these romantic visions of Shining Path, making them sound, good mean. I mean, some people can support them and you can do it, but you can't do it via euphemisms like the right does. Like there was no human rights abuses. This is just fighting terrorism. Or the other side would be the Shining Path supporters saying they did nothing. This was just minor sacrifices in the long road to revolution. Well, if you went in and killed a family of 14 or, put a car bomb in, these are things that have to be questioned. That's my, I hope to contribute to this. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unbelievably.
Could you repeat the essence of the
Yeah,
question?
I'm sorry. On Zoom, what are the archive challenges, particularly for the trials and the Consejo de Ministros? I would love to lie and say I was just persistent. I went every day at 4 a.m, and 6 months later, I went to the archive. I mean, I was going to the archive for other stuff, and a friend said, I owe a lot. And we're not going to name them, but 2 dear friends of mine, historians in Lima, said, you're not going to believe that these child trials are open, and you get it. And you so you ask for, I can't remember the name of it, Juzgado de Menores, and you get a 14-year-old pickpocket, a 17-year-old kid was selling weed, and a 15-year-old kid was caught, stealing from a store, and then so-and-so, and it's always a fatter file for terrorismo. And that was public. And some people say I should be really careful. Let's hope it still is. And the same with the trial. There was a new sort of access. There were new new archives open, and I just sort of asked for it. And a friend, I owe this person a lot, and it's unbelievable. And I made a copy because these things can disappear and go. The Consejo Ministros, weirdly, is a public archive. I can send you, if you're really bored, a 8 PDF of all these. I mean, it's boring, cabinet. You can imagine cabinet, but they're pretty frank. I mean, it's not completely. I mean, I know off the record they're saying, hey, my brother-in-law is like got a construction company. I mean, there's a lot of cronyism. That's not there, of course, but they really argue like, what do we call these people and things like that. So I was very fortunate since. Yes.
Obviously the US has historically and now
Yeah.
strong hand in a lot of Latin American
Yeah.
politics and different,
Right.
moments of violence and things. And I just wondered, I mean, I know you've talked about
Right.
this more of a homegrown
Yeah.
situation. I wondered if less had any hand in this at all.
Right.
or
No,
going forward.
It's great. I just wrote that section. I want to socialize it because I'm going to get some criticism. The U.S. records for the Reagan period are quite open. You can also get, and this is, just persistence and, they're all blacked out and things like that, but it's pretty open. Reagan did not like Belunde. I mean, Reagan is complete, Latin America for him is El Salvador. It's all he cared about, except if there was, oil prices, Venezuela, or things like that. And Belunde would seem like that he had, spent time. He had been an architecture professor when he'd been deposed in Johns Hopkins and Harvard and somewhere else. Spoke English really well, moderate. A lot of his cabinet, they're divided, were the early neoliberals. They really didn't give him much. They didn't see him as a priority. The Peruvian government, for example, Belunde supported Argentina in the Malvinas Falkland conflict, which really threw it. And there's a lot of the Belunde people said we sort of like we expected more. The economic situation is atrocious. This is just literally like months before, I don't know when it is, when Mexico can't pay back. The lost decade begins right here. Peru is like 80% inflation, growing unemployment is really, really hard. The ministers are always saying, why doesn't DC help us? This is going to grow. The US, of course, did support with military aid, and this is something I've got to get more on. And I know there's a couple people who are very critical and say there's a US funded repression. Certainly did. A lot of the grenades were given, helicopters, but not nearly as much as Belunde expected. And I talked to a former ambassador and a couple people. They were smart enough to know the US should not go near, because a guerrilla war in the Andes by a group that would love to wrap themselves in sort of Maoist nationalism, if you will. The interview was like, we knew that, the day they killed 2 Marines, that was going to be it. So the US militarily stayed out of it. But I do have to do more. And I know there's some good authors who are going to blast me and say the gringos covering up for gringos. I hope I'm not.
Okay, so I think we do have to finish at 1, so we have about time for one more question comment that
Okay.
I have here on Zoom.
Okay.
But Professor Walker has graciously agreed to stay for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like.
Few minutes, I'll stay till 5.
There we go, if you'd like to continue the conversation. So this is from Ignacio Cancino, I hope I pronounced your name right. The year 82 is a very important year in Peru. One could almost say that it was when the first signs of the failed democratic transition in the country began to appear, which one might roughly place around 76, 77. The state of emergency at the end of the year in Ayacucho, where the military once again took power in parts of the country. And in 83, the economic boom of the second Belunde era began to collapse. In other words, the prison issue is part of this larger picture, isn't it?
Yeah, no, great summary, and I completely agree. This is part of Belunde. There's great optimism, and it's falling apart. It's not just, I don't want to say everything is because of this one event, but it's a very good summary. The economic, I hadn't realized, I was saying last night, a couple of Peruvians, Alan Garcia is in government in 1985. That's when there's hyperinflation, 1,000% or whatever it was. It's already 60, 70. I don't have the numbers in front of me. The economic decline is there. And you see them within the ministros, this group that are fiscal conservatives, neoliberales. They're called the impronunciables because it's PPK, Kuczynski, Webb. They all have foreign names, either English or Eastern European, versus Alvaro Landini, which is who is more of a traditional populist. But Belunde, they are nailed economically. You have the terrible El Nino in 82, 83, flooding, which just devastates the little areas of in the north. So no, it's a very, very tough year, and it really is. This is part of it. It is one of those years that I hope I can capture that. But I thank you for the really good summary. One more? Maybe not.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
I guess similar to what the previous question is still, and it's basically in terms of the right. Talk a little bit about like smart. So what is the hero writing? What is the? It is very tricky to signal the specific evolutionary moments or moments.
Right.
So in terms of that transformation, right, like the militarization of the political.
Right.
One night that this all, at least in our Latin American countries, I mean, it is hard to point out, like, for instance, in the Colombian Cape, right, what was the massacre?
Right.
You know, hundred that happened, right, what was the one that actually, and so there is kind of like creation here, confluence, so you can talk a little bit about like how you as you're a colonialist, like.
Right.
You're in the past, like,
Yeah.
But something that is so close, it's hard to write to reach that space. Pieces come from that inflection point.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is I really just do want to, if I can capture a moment, this is where microhistory, is wonderful, because if I can get it, if I can write a book where people who live then can read it and feel like that was their world, that's a great contribution. But I really do believe it's a very important moment for all these, the economic reasons it captures it. The question of, it's not only, well, is that event, the more famous event that's coming just down the road is Churacay, when 13, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers. Journalists are killed, and they actually, their pictures are all very cucho. They're going out to cover the countryside. They are killed by campesinos, indígenas, quechua hablantes. Ponciano del Pino, who I mentioned, published a wonderful award-winning book on that. That, in a sense, is more known. So I don't exaggerate, like, not the world would have been different if this night hadn't happened, but I really do think in terms of building the jails, maybe they would have been built anyway. The human rights community, with people I've talked to, who, and that's a story that's not been written, is I think it's there, but it's hard not to then just be rhetorical, like all academics, like every back cover blurb, the moment that changed Peru, or the factor that to understand iconography in colonial Nueva Granada. So I don't want to be excessive about this, but I'm very happy because it's my sort of hunches have proven truer and truer, and I haven't like gotten to, well, it's a nice moment. So it's a very roundabout answer, but thank you. So.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you.